It was early morning. The air smelled like fresh dirt, and my farm animals were doing what they always did, moving, breathing, living peacefully on my land. Then two black SUVs rolled up to my gate, kicking dust into the air. A woman stepped out. Sharp suit. Dark sunglasses. She didn't greet me. She didn't hesitate. She pointed her finger straight at me and shouted, "These animals are illegal. You have 48 hours." I didn't say a word. Because the moment she spoke, I already knew. This was the HOA. She waved a clipboard and said, "Community rules don't allow livestock." Then she looked at my goats, my chickens, my horses, and added, "Remove them. Or we will." Neighbors had started gathering behind her. Some were filming. Others stood frozen, afraid to speak. "Standing on my land," she said. "You don't own this decision anymore." That was her biggest mistake. Because what she didn't know, this land had never belonged to the HOA. And the folder I was holding in my hands contained an original land deed from the 1940s. And the moment that paper came out, the power in that conversation flipped completely. Before we continue, drop your country or city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you stand for justice over control, hit like and subscribe, because this channel exists to remind the powerful that history never forgets. This farm wasn't something I bought on a whim or inherited without meaning. It was a piece of land tied to memory, labor, and time. Long before fences were straightened and roads were paved nearby, this place already existed, quiet, open, and alive. Every morning followed the same rhythm. The sun climbed slowly, lighting the pasture from the front, not behind, and the animals responded like clockwork. Chickens scattered near the fence line. Goats moved in tight groups. The horses stayed calm, watching everything the way they always had. This wasn't noise. This was order. This was home. The land had been in my family for generations. My grandfather used to say this soil remembered every footprint. He taught us how to respect it, how to work with it, not against it. When he passed, the land didn't feel empty, it felt entrusted. Like something I was meant to protect, not just use. Years later, neighborhoods started creeping closer. New houses. Fresh asphalt. Perfect lawns trimmed within an inch of their lives. Along with them came signs, rules, committees, boards. Homeowners associations. People who believed order only existed on paper. But this land never joined them. It was never annexed. Never signed over. Never agreed to be governed by someone else's standards. I knew that. I had always known that. The animals were legal. The fences were permitted. The boundaries were surveyed and recorded long before anyone thought of calling it a community. Still, I kept everything clean, respectful, and contained. No wandering livestock. No complaints, at least none that came to me directly. So when that HOA SUV showed up at my gate, it felt surreal. Like someone walking into the wrong house and acting confident anyway. They looked at my farm like it was a violation. I looked at it like a legacy. And that difference, between paperwork power and lived history, was about to turn into a battle they never expected. The first notice didn't arrive with shouting or threats. It came folded neatly inside a white envelope, slid under my gate like it belonged there. The letterhead read Community Standards Enforcement. No name. No signature. Just a logo and a list of violations that didn't make sense. Unauthorized livestock. Noise disturbances. Health and safety concerns. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because I couldn't believe they were talking about my land. My animals weren't wandering. They weren't neglected. And most importantly, this property wasn't part of any HOA jurisdiction. Still, I chose calm. I wrote back. My response was respectful, clear, and documented. I explained the boundaries. I referenced county permits. I attached survey maps that showed, in plain black lines, where their authority ended and my land began. I even included a short note: this property has never been part of your association. For a few days, everything went quiet. Too quiet. Then the second notice came. This time, it wasn't an envelope. It was a bright-colored warning taped directly to my fence, where neighbors could see it. The language had changed. Now it said final notice. Now there was a deadline. 72 hours. The animals were suddenly described as a public nuisance. The letter warned of fines, enforcement actions, possible removal. That's when irritation set in. Not fear, irritation. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a test. I called the number listed. A woman answered, her tone smooth but dismissive. She didn't ask questions. She didn't review documents. She just repeated phrases like they were rehearsed. Community harmony. Uniform standards. You'll need to comply. When I reminded her, again, that my land was not part of their HOA, she paused for half a second. Then she said, "That will be determined." Determined by who? Certainly not by history. Certainly not by the county. The deadline was shortened. 48 hours. A small HOA vehicle started driving by my fence line, slowing down, taking photos. Not of violations, but of intimidation. Neighbors began asking questions. Some whispered support. Others avoided eye contact, afraid of becoming the next target. And that's when I understood what was really happening. They weren't enforcing rules. They were expanding control. My farm wasn't loud or illegal, it was inconvenient. It didn't match their aesthetic. And instead of respecting boundaries, they decided to erase them. What they didn't realize was simple. I had already documented everything. Every notice. Every call. Every photo they took. And the more they pushed, the clearer it became. This wasn't going to end quietly. The next time they came, they didn't bother with paper notices. They came in person, confident, loud, and uninvited. 2 HOA vehicles pulled up right past my gate line, tires crunching over gravel that wasn't theirs to touch. The same woman from before stepped out first. No clipboard this time. No polite language. Just authority, worn like a costume. Behind her were 2 men in branded jackets, already holding up phones, recording my property as if they had every right to be there. I walked toward them slowly. Calm on the outside. Focused. Before I could speak, she raised her voice so the neighbors could hear. "We've given you more than enough time." She gestured broadly toward the pasture, toward the animals that had been here longer than her association ever existed. "This is not a farm community. This is a residential area." I told her, evenly, that she was standing on private land. That she needed to step back behind the fence line. She laughed, actually laughed, and shook her head. "You don't get to decide that anymore." That sentence was deliberate. It was meant to humiliate. One of the men started snapping photos of the animals up close. Another walked the fence line, counting heads out loud, like inventory. Chickens. Goats. Horses. Numbers being spoken as if they were already seized. Neighbors began to gather again. This time, more of them. Some stood with arms crossed, uncomfortable. Others whispered. A few recorded openly now, phones held chest high. The HOA president noticed, and instead of backing down, she leaned into it. "Let this be a lesson," she said loudly. "Rules apply to everyone." She accused me of lowering property values. Of creating health risks. Of ignoring warnings. None of it was true. But truth wasn't the point. When I reminded her, calmly, that the county had already approved my land use, her tone hardened. County paperwork doesn't override community authority. That was the moment I realized how far they were willing to go. She stepped closer, invading my space, pointing her finger inches from my chest. If these animals are not removed, she said, we will proceed with enforcement. That includes fines, liens, and seizure. Seizure of living beings. One of my neighbors spoke up, quietly at first, asking whether they actually had jurisdiction. She turned on him instantly. This does not concern you. And just like that, fear rippled through the crowd. Heads lowered. Phones dipped. That's how power abuse works, not through strength, but through silence. Then she did something worse. She called the police. Right there. In front of everyone. She told them there was a non-compliant landowner, refusing to follow HOA rules, creating a disturbance. She didn't mention the boundaries. She didn't mention the documents. She framed it as defiance. While we waited, her confidence grew. She spoke openly about timelines, about removal crews, about how this would set a precedent. I stood there and said nothing. Not because I was afraid, but because I was ready. In my truck, locked and untouched, was a folder I had carried for years. Not for fights like this, but for protection. Old paper. Official stamps. History that didn't care about modern authority. As the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, I watched her face. She thought she had one. She had no idea the moment she'd created. Because the louder she got, the more witnesses there were. And when power abuses the wrong land, history has a way of answering back. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd had gathered along the edges of my property. Neighbors peered from driveways and porches, some with cameras, some just curious. The tension was thick, almost physical, like the air itself was waiting for someone to make the first move. The HOA president was the first to speak, loudly and confidently. She waved the police over like they were her allies, not public servants. Officer, she began, this resident refuses to comply with community rules. Livestock is here illegally, and we've exhausted all attempts to resolve this. The officers nodded politely, their expressions neutral, but I could see the flicker of doubt in their eyes. They glanced at the property, at the animals grazing peacefully, at the neat fences and clear pastures. Nothing here looked illegal. Nothing violated any codes. I stepped forward calmly, holding the folder of deeds tightly. Officer, I said evenly, this land has never been part of their HOA. Every boundary is documented. Every permit is on record. One of the officers raised an eyebrow. Do you have documentation? He asked. I nodded and handed over the folder. The moment he opened it, the room changed. The papers were official, stamped, dated, from the 1940s. Maps, deeds, county signatures. Every line and seal proved my ownership, every word contradicting the HOA's claims. The HOA president stiffened. Her confident posture faltered. The cameras in the crowd clicked, capturing every reaction. Wait, one officer said slowly, scanning the documents. This proves your ownership? Yes, I replied. Calm, controlled. They have no jurisdiction here. They've overstepped every limit. The officer turned to the HOA president, who opened her mouth, then shut it. She had no words, no immediate defense. Her team shifted nervously, realizing the dynamic had changed. Neighbors began murmuring among themselves, pointing to the deed and shaking their heads. Some whispered, some laughed quietly, relief mixing with disbelief. One neighbor, braver than the rest, spoke up. So you're saying all this time we've been lied to? The HOA president's glare was sharp, but it didn't stop the truth from spreading. Another neighbor pulled out their phone, capturing the moment when the officer confirmed the deed's legitimacy. The police finally addressed the HOA directly. You're overstepping your authority, the officer said. These animals are on private land, legally owned. You cannot seize them or enforce rules outside your jurisdiction. For the first time that day, the HOA president looked powerless. The carefully maintained image of control shattered. The neighbors, silent witnesses until now, erupted with quiet but unmistakable approval. Phones raised, eyes wide, murmurs growing. I stepped back, letting the silence settle. The air was lighter now, filled with relief instead of intimidation. Power had shifted in the open, and everyone present could see it. What began as a routine abuse of authority had turned into a public exposure. The HOA's attempt at control was now visible to everyone, recorded for posterity. The animals grazed calmly, oblivious to the chaos they had indirectly survived. And in that moment, one thing was clear: when authority is misused, history and documentation will always have the final word. The tension had reached a point where every heartbeat felt louder than the SUVs parked along the roadside. The HOA president still lingered, smirking as though she had already won, while a small crowd of neighbors and onlookers hovered at the edges of the property, phones raised, eyes wide. But I wasn't nervous. I had something they could never anticipate, a history they had tried to erase, a truth they couldn't fabricate. I reached for the folder I had kept in my truck for years, tucked safely away beneath the passenger seat. It was worn, slightly yellowed at the edges, but intact: original deeds, county stamps, and survey maps dating back decades. Every page was a reminder that this land had never belonged to any HOA, that my family had preserved it through time, and that authority without legitimacy was nothing but an illusion. I walked slowly toward the crowd, deliberately unfolding the folder, letting the weight of it register. The HOA president noticed and stiffened. She squinted at the papers but said nothing, trying to mask the flicker of doubt crossing her face. The men standing with her shifted uneasily, as if sensing the tide of control slipping from their hands. I held up the first document. The ink had faded slightly, but the official seals were unmistakable. County stamps from the 1940s marked every page. Handwritten notations confirmed boundaries. Survey maps showed exact lines, lines that their modern, plastic signs couldn't override. This, I said, voice steady, is the original land deed. Dated from the 1940s. Every inch of this property has been legally ours for decades, long before your association even existed. The HOA president opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. I flipped the pages slowly, letting the neighbors see every signature, every stamp. The crowd leaned in. Phones raised higher. Murmurs spread like wildfire. One of the officers standing nearby glanced at the papers and then back at me. His expression changed from polite curiosity to astonishment. He read silently, nodding as the weight of the evidence sank in. This is valid," he said finally, his tone measured but firm. "This clearly proves your ownership." The HOA president's face drained of color. She glanced at her team, but their confident expressions were gone. The cameras were capturing her reaction in real time, and there was nothing she could do to reclaim the image of control she had tried to project all morning. Neighbors whispered among themselves. "So they lied the whole time," someone said. Another shook his head in disbelief. Some laughed quietly, relieved. Phones continued recording as the reality sank in. The HOA had no authority over this land, and the animals they claimed were illegal were perfectly protected by decades of documented ownership. I stepped back and allowed the moment to breathe. The deed, simple as paper, had shifted the power dynamic instantly. The HOA's arrogance, their threats, their public posturing, it all crumbled under the weight of history. "Every notice," I said, addressing the crowd now, "every threat, every attempt to intimidate me, this proves they were acting outside their rights. And now, everyone here can see it." The HOA president opened her mouth again, but the crowd had grown bolder. Phones recorded her hesitation. The officers, now clearly on my side of reason, took a step forward. The balance had shifted irreversibly. I held the folder one last time and closed it carefully, letting the moment linger. The animals grazed peacefully in the pasture behind me, unaware that their existence had just been defended in full view of the community. The lesson was clear: when authority is misused, the truth, properly documented, will always emerge. And in that emergence, the people who tried to wield power unjustly are revealed, not as leaders, but as overreaching, powerless figures standing against history itself. For the HOA, this morning was a turning point. For the community, it was a lesson. And for me, it was the moment justice began to take shape, not quietly, but in full daylight, in front of everyone who witnessed the truth. The land deed didn't just prove ownership. It proved that history, preparation, and persistence could outmatch arrogance, intimidation, and false authority. And in that calm, surreal moment, I realized the fight was far from over, but I had already won the most important battle, exposing the truth for all to see. The tension that had built on the farm followed us into the courtroom. I arrived early, folder in hand, knowing every document inside was a shield, a sword, and the ultimate evidence of the truth. The HOA representatives were already there, flanked by lawyers with crisp suits and confident expressions. They walked with the kind of arrogance that assumes authority is unchallengeable. The judge entered, and silence fell. His presence demanded attention, but more importantly, it reminded everyone that here, only law mattered, not intimidation, not bluster, not past assumptions. The HOA lawyer began immediately, presenting the case with practiced confidence. He claimed I had violated community rules, disrupted harmony, and failed to comply with warnings. He used phrases like defiance and community standards repeatedly, as though repeating a word enough times made it law. I listened quietly, letting them speak. Calm and composed, I opened my folder and laid out the first piece of evidence, the original land deed, dated from the 1940s. The judge leaned forward, scanning the documents carefully. Every page, the official stamps, the survey maps, the historical notations, spoke for itself. These documents clearly establish ownership, I said, my voice steady. At no point has this property been part of the HOA or subject to their authority. Their attempts to enforce rules here have no legal foundation. The courtroom was silent. Even the HOA lawyer faltered for a moment, fumbling through his papers, trying to find a counter. He cited modern community standards, but they didn't apply to land outside HOA jurisdiction. The more he argued, the more the truth of my case became evident. I called witnesses, neighbors who had seen the confrontations firsthand, officers who had reviewed the land deeds on site, and surveyors who confirmed the property boundaries. Each testimony reinforced the documents. This land had been legally owned and maintained, and no HOA authority ever applied. At one point, the HOA president tried to speak, attempting to claim misunderstanding or clerical error, but the judge interrupted firmly. This court recognizes documented history over verbal claims, he stated. All evidence presented shows the HOA exceeded its authority. The room shifted. Confidence drained from the HOA representatives. Their lawyers exchanged glances, realizing the legal foundation of their argument had collapsed. The documents weren't just paper, they were irrefutable proof of decades of ownership and lawful rights. The judge reviewed each page, comparing survey lines with official maps, checking dates, and noting inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. Every violation they tried to assert was invalid. Every fine threatened, unlawful. Every seizure planned, impossible under the law. When it was time for closing statements, I spoke directly to the court. Authority is earned through legality and fairness, not intimidation. This property has been preserved, maintained, and respected for generations. Attempts to bully and coerce are not only morally wrong, they are legally void. The judge nodded, his tone measured but final. The HOA has exceeded its authority. Any claims, fines, or enforcement actions against this property are null and void. This court orders the HOA to cease and desist any further interference, and to formally recognize the landowner's rights. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Relief, disbelief, and triumph mingled in the air. The HOA president's face was pale. Her lawyers tried to argue further, but the ruling was absolute. Documentation, witnesses, and history had spoken louder than their arrogance ever could. As I left the courtroom, folder in hand, I realized something profound. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement. Truth, when supported by evidence and persistence, cannot be silenced. Power may attempt to intimidate, but history, law, and justice will always have the final say. The animals were safe. The land was secure. And the HOA had been publicly exposed for what they truly were, overreaching and powerless when confronted with truth. Justice had been served, not quietly, not behind closed doors, but fully, publicly, and undeniably. The courtroom victory was official, but the real climax came the moment the HOA realized just how exposed they were, not just in legal terms, but in public perception. As the judge's gavel fell, confirming every claim in my favor, a collective gasp went through the room. The HOA president sat frozen, her perfectly maintained confidence shattered in an instant. Her lawyers shuffled papers, trying to mask their defeat, but it was too late. Everyone present had seen the truth. Outside, neighbors who had once whispered from driveways now spoke openly. Phones were out, recording every reaction, every flush of embarrassment. The local community had witnessed the shift, power abused, arrogance punished. The animals, safe on my property, grazed quietly as if they knew victory belonged to them too. The HOA president tried one last desperate move, raising her voice to claim misunderstanding, trying to rewrite the story in real time. But the judge's ruling and the land deed left no room for argument. Her words fell flat, echoing hollowly against the walls of authority she had once imagined she commanded. The media, even local news channels, picked up the story. Clips of the confrontation on my farm, the officer reviewing the deed, neighbors watching the exchange, and finally, the courtroom ruling circulated widely. Comments flooded in online, outrage at the HOA's audacity, admiration for standing up to intimidation, and astonishment at how decades-old documentation could reverse such blatant abuse of power. For me, the climax wasn't just the legal victory, it was the total exposure of their behavior. The president's forced apology, the formal acknowledgement of my property rights, and the public humiliation of their entire board became the ultimate reversal of control. Every lie they told, every attempt to intimidate, had been turned against them. Even weeks later, the community still talked about it. People who had doubted my ownership now stopped by the farm, curious, respectful, sometimes even apologetic for having believed the HOA's lies. And the message was clear to anyone who tried to overstep: authority has limits. Truth, backed by evidence and courage, will always win. In the end, standing on my land, looking at the animals and the field stretching out under the daylight, I understood something essential. The fight wasn't just for me, it was for everyone who had been silenced by misplaced power. For the neighbors who witnessed injustice and stayed quiet. For the animals who had no voice. And for the principle that no organization, no matter how confident, can erase history or law. The climax wasn't loud, flashy, or chaotic. It was undeniable. It was public. It was complete. The HOA had tried to control my farm, my animals, my life, but in the end, they were the ones exposed, powerless, and humiliated in front of everyone who mattered. The dust had finally settled, both on my land and in the community. The HOA, once confident and aggressive, had been exposed for overstepping every boundary. Their threats, fines, and intimidation were rendered meaningless. Every neighbor who had watched the confrontations unfold now understood the truth: authority is only as real as its legitimacy. My animals grazed peacefully under the open sky, unaware of the chaos their existence had survived. The fences stood intact, the fields untouched, and the sunlight fell gently across the pasture, lighting the land that had been preserved for generations. Conversations among neighbors shifted. Where there had once been whispered doubts or fear of retaliation, there was now admiration, respect, and a renewed sense of community grounded in truth and fairness. People who had doubted me stopped by to acknowledge the injustice that had been attempted and to celebrate the victory. For me, this wasn't just a legal win, it was a reminder of why standing firm against intimidation matters. Some battles are about land, some about animals, but most are about principle. When courage, preparation, and history align, even the most confident oppressors can be held accountable. And as I looked over the fields, the animals, and the peaceful horizon, I knew one thing for certain: justice doesn't just whisper, it always finds its way to the light.